Egypt has launched airstrikes against targets in Libya. It's in response to another attack against Egyptian Christians claimed by ISIL. But has Egypt failed to protect its Christian minority? And how much of a security threat does Libya pose? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle Carey. Egyptian jets have carried out a number of airstrikes in Libya in retaliation for an attack that killed 29 Christians in central Egypt. The airstrikes targeted camps near Derna, where armed men responsible for the attack are believed to have been trained. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi argued in a speech after the attack that countries sponsoring what he called terrorism would be punished. But is targeting Libya the answer to the growing number of attacks targeting Christians in Egypt? Victoria Gatenby sets up our discussion.
The strike targeted what the Egyptian president called terrorist camps in the eastern port city of Derna. It was in response to Friday's bus massacre targeting Egyptian Christians in Minya, 225 kilometers south of Cairo. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has warned that states who sponsor what he calls terrorism will be punished and that Egypt will not hesitate to carry out more airstrikes.
What we have seen today will not be left without a response. The training camps for these elements, as I speak to you, are being bombarded with a massive strike. Egypt will never hesitate to strike the terrorist camps anywhere.
Christians make up 10% of the population in Egypt. Attacks targeting them have increased over the last 6 months. A suicide bombing claimed by ISIL killed 29 worshippers at the main Christian cathedral in Cairo in December. And last month, ISIL claimed responsibility for bombing churches in Tanta and Alexandria, which killed 46 people.
ISIS, they try and, take advantage of the deep-rooted sectarian tensions in Egypt to, swell its ranks and weaken the existing central government and their control over, mostly remote areas. In this situation in Upper Egypt and Minya government, where there have been historic tensions.
Some Egyptians, though, question Sisi's strategy of carrying out airstrikes in Libya.
Sisi has no right to hit Libya, and if he knew that this was an area of danger for Egypt, why hasn't he protected all the border, the Egyptian-Libyan border? And how could he, within 6 hours, have figured out who committed the crimes and where they are from and went out to kill them?
Armed groups, some of whom are affiliated with ISIL, have been increasing attacks against security forces in the Sinai Peninsula since 2013. The government says the aim of the military operation there and in Libya is to defeat armed groups that are trying to destabilize the country. But attacks like this show security is still a major challenge. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera.
Let's bring in our guests now. In London, Anas Gomati, a political analyst and director of the Tripoli-based Sadeq Institute. And by Skype in Berlin, Ahmed Badawi, senior researcher at the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Politics at the Free University of Berlin. Thank you both for joining me. Anas, I want to start with you. So Egypt has responded to these attacks by launching airstrikes in Libya. Do you think that they actually know who is responsible and are targeting correctly?
So given the swiftness of the retaliation and given the clear message in Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's speech yesterday, I don't think they do know who is responsible, but I think what they need to be doing and what the strategy reflects is that they want to be seen to be knowing what they're doing. They want to be seen to be a strong international actor, and they want to be seen to be strong in front of their people. And that is really where the majority of these efforts towards striking in Libya stem from, is that this is a message not for the Libyan people and not even for the people of Derna where the strikes took place, but this is ultimately a demonstration of strength to the local population. And now the choice of targets are intriguing. Now Derna, which was struck last night and yesterday in the late evening, Derna was a city that in 2014 fell prey to ISIS. It set up its first province in Libya, in that city, in the eastern city of Derna. But within a year and a half, the residents and the local armed groups in the city had fought very, very strongly and had lost many men, but had pushed out ISIS. ISIS, by its own account, accepts that it no longer holds territory in Derna. And ISIS is certainly in the business, it's certainly in the business of projecting strength. So I find it highly intriguing and if not ironic that the choice of target was the very city that had been expelled and void of ISIS. But now, if we look at the local civil war in Libya and the two sides that are fighting in the civil war, Derna is on the side that is against the side that is backed by the Egyptian government, and therefore it's a likely choice for the Egyptians to retaliate. They haven't hit a friend of the country, they've hit a target that is hostile to their local partners in the country.
Ahmed, what do you make of this choice of target?
No, I totally agree with that. And then, of course, I would like to add that given the Libyan connection to the Manchester terrorist attack, I think in addition to what my colleague said, in addition to that, I think the Egyptian government also wants to send a message to the international community that we are also part of this global war on terrorism. And this is also obvious in the statement that was made by Sisi when he addressed President Trump, called President Trump by his name, asking him that, look here, you promised that you would help in the war on terrorism. So I think I really think it's a very cynical move on behalf of the Egyptian government to somehow bank on this sad incident.
Sounds like you're cynical, and it sounds like you're saying completely ineffective as well.
I don't see how it could be effective. They're targeting a place that I don't see how it could ever possibly have anything to do with what happened in Minya. This desert road where this attack took place, it's a very local affair. People know the geography very well. Obviously, they know exactly what to expect. They know the exact route to this monastery where these poor victims were going on a pilgrimage. And we also see from the perpetrators of the previous two incidents in April and in December, all of them were homegrown. All of them had bases in the country. The perpetrator of the attack in December was actually arrested by the Egyptian security forces at one point and was later released. So I don't see how effective it would be to just divert the attention in such a cynical way, whether to show that you are just being strong or to gain some kudos with the international community. I really don't see how this could be effective in the real internal problem that Egypt is currently suffering from.
Let's talk more about the internal problem that Egypt is suffering. Anas, I want to come to you on that. There is a school of thought that those who are responsible actually came from inside Egypt. Does that possibility carry some weight with you?
There's been a low-level counterterrorism strategy that started years ago, and this is something that was even inherited from pre-Sisi era and certainly into the Mubarak era, but a counter-terrorism strategy that was needed for the Sinai Peninsula, and that has now shifted into a counter-insurgency strategy, but at times needs to flip-flop between both, because what is happening in Sinai is certainly not under the control of the government of Egypt, and I think they need to be able to look at this and say that's really where the majority of the problems are stemming from, whether it be Ansar Bait al-Maqdis or whether it be ISIS as a whole, as a regional kind of actor here, and they don't really have an idea of, as to how vulnerable they are. And again, the choice of targeting outside of Egypt to show that they have everything under control is perhaps the first strategy, but as my esteemed colleague has said already, this need to tap into not only the opportunity but the currency that ISIS provides. And ISIS is certainly a currency in no other way that other groups have been since Al-Qaeda in 2001.
So if I can
ISIS
stop you,
since 2014 have provided this.
I don't want to oversimplify what you're saying, but are you saying that sometimes it's easy to shift the focus to ISIL when you don't want to actually deal with what's going on in your own backyard? Is that what you're saying?
I think they're certainly dealing with it, but I don't think they're dealing with it in the most effective way. I think this really calls into question whether or not military regimes in 2017 poses a basic, simple question. Is the military fit to run a country as dynamic and as complex as that, with its myriad security threats, and the objectivity and the impartiality that you need, the kind of civilian oversight that you need to make sure that if someone is killed in an incident by the military, that a civilian is held accountable for that. The economy and its diversity and its difficulty to be able to handle at such a turbulent moment in 2017, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And so what I'm saying is, yes, perhaps they are doing things to try to fight ISIS, but is it enough? And at this very moment in time, the first strategy is to look and to tell the Egyptian people, who are the main demographic, these are the people that will keep you in charge, come Monday, come Tuesday. You have to manage their expectations and you have to manage their vision of what is happening. And this is certainly an expectation management exercise. And it's saying to them, this was not something that we had that was here. This is not negligence on the behalf of the military services in Sinai. These are these nasty Libyans that are across the border that are doing things. And don't ask too many questions, because we know that Derna has already been, has been void and expelled of ISIS. But the reality is it's hoping for the best with that kind of messaging. But beyond that, tomorrow, it's certainly trying to tap into the international currency that is available by fighting ISIS, or be seen to be fighting ISIS, not only domestically, where it would be like in Sinai, but also regionally and internationally, like it would be in Libya and elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa.
Ahmed, something that you actually referenced a while ago is this. It seems that President Sisi and Donald Trump seem to have some sort of affinity for each other. What do you think that says about how Egypt will approach things like this going forward?
I don't see any identifiable strategy, to be honest. I think it will be just more of the same. I think deep down, I think the problem is a problem of incompetency. I don't question the motivation of the Egyptian state. Obviously, the Egyptian state is not going to be helped by any terrorist attacks like that. And I don't think they have an interest. When we say that maybe they are capitalizing on these attacks when they happen, this is not the same thing as saying that they have an interest in actually seeing these attacks happening. They erode their legitimacy, they destroy their credibility. So I don't think that they have a strategy. It will just be more of the same. And I think that the real problem is a problem of incompetency, the incapacity to manage the country now. Whether economically, politically, or now, as we see, also on a very basic security level, I think this is where the problem lies. And I think it's showing, at least me, but I'm sure it's showing many other people, how fragile the Egyptian state has become. And I think it has become so fragile because it's not getting its priorities right. For example, we've seen that there was an emergency laws that were declared right after the previous incident, the one that we just had in April. What happened? How did the government, how did the state use this emergency law? The last thing we've seen over the last 2 weeks, there has been a massive wave of arrests of young people from political parties that have absolutely nothing to do with terrorism. So I think if the government, if the state does not get its priorities right in terms of trying to consolidate the internal domestic front by reducing the tensions, by reducing the level of political polarization, a lot of these incidents would be repeated, and then the government would be totally at a loss at what to do about them, because they are not looking at the real cause of these attacks. The fact that terror... Go ahead.
Just a moment. I want to bring Anas into this. First of all, it's Anas. It seems that Ahmed is saying that, as you said, that the country doesn't really seem to have a strategy for attacks like this. In particular, what has the government been doing to try to protect groups that are being targeted? Why are the Coptic Christians continually being targeted?
Well, I certainly think that's much more of a focus on ISIS themselves, and there is certainly a challenge of delivering security to vulnerable minorities like Copts. And to agree with Ahmed, it's certainly not in the interest of the government, of the regime, to allow attacks like this to happen. It certainly does nothing for their long-term ambitions of staying in power and retaining that power for the long term. But in terms of the choice of target, this is a quintessential choice of target for ISIS. It's sectarian, so it can find those two bordering divisions amongst the larger population and try to look at ways in which to fan those flames more regionally. It does that in Libya, whether it goes for different tribes and the vulnerable kind of sensitivities amongst those different tribes. So it doesn't make, it's not so different to what they're doing in Egypt, so to speak. But in terms of trying to erode the legitimacy of the government, that is really where they have the unique edge in Egypt. And what they're able to do is to demonstrate that the Egyptian government doesn't really have control on that. And I think it also understands that it won't act in any real meaningful way. It won't have a strategy. It still won't really prioritize ISIS or quarantine ISIS to being the only actor that is really kind of jeopardizing state security and human security in Egypt. Because the reality is the Egyptian state perceives a threat around the corner in every sense, and it feels that it's being manifest in every single way, whether it be political parties, internally or externally, whether it be regional partners that are trying to stop making Egypt great again. I mean, there is 1,000,001 ways that the Egyptian state perceives of threats, but it doesn't necessarily put ISIS right at the top. I think it puts it being in charge. The regime maintenance strategy is really crucial here, and I think they've conflated counter-terrorism with regime maintenance, and that's why they're allowing these things, these resources that you need to put right at the top. You need to put all your resources at the top. You need to really prioritize and strategize to making sure that ISIS and all of your resources in states are being used and managed effectively to wiping out that threat or exterminating that threat or at least minimizing that threat. But if you're looking at who's keeping you in charge and trying to sustain your regime in every other way, then I don't think it really is a balancing of those two kind of priorities. And I think it's acts like this that show that not only the fragility, as Ahmed said, but also the vulnerability when you're not managing your resources properly.
The border, Egyptian-Libyan border is 1,100 kilometers long. It's a monstrosity of a border. How much of a handle has Egypt tried to get on that porous border over the last few years, Ahmed?
I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, but my impression is that this should primarily be an intelligence effort rather than a direct surveillance effort. Of course, it's very difficult to monitor such a porous and long border, and I think the main task here would be an intelligence task. Now, I'm not sure how effective Egyptian intelligence is in terms of penetrating this terrain, this geography. How many eyes do they have with the local tribes in the area? These are all things that I'm sorry, I don't have much information about. But what I know is that this has to be an intelligence effort rather than a direct surveillance effort. There's simply no technology that, as far as I know, Egypt does not have the kind of technology that would allow it to directly observe every inch of this border. So yes, intelligence must have the prime of place in this effort here.
Anas, is part of the root of what has to happen is that Libya needs to be stabilized, and if so, what does that look like?
It's a very difficult question, but just to briefly mention something that Ahmed has said, I mean, this notion, there are transnational groups on Libya's borders, be it on the Egyptian border with Libya, with the Awlad Ali tribe, or whether it be the Tabu and Tuareg that are spread transnationally amongst the Sahel and Sahara into Chad, Niger, Sudan, Algeria. So what it tells you is Libya's border security is a phenomenon that is tied to the border security and the ethnographic security and the demographics of each side of the border. So it's not only do we share pieces of lines in the sand, we share people that are contesting their own passports, their own nationality on both sides. Are they Egyptian? Are they Libyan? Are they Sudanese? Are they Libyan? Are they Chadian? Are they Libyan? In that sense, Libya's problems in stabilizing Libya is going to have to be not only a regional effort, but it's also an international effort. And I think the first thing is that today Libya presents it has for the last 5 years, has presented local actors with a $65 billion question, which was roughly the national budget every year. There was so much money at hand and so much to be won that all the actors were fighting over themselves and falling over themselves for either the narrative, which was either revolutionary or counter-terrorism, or the currency, which is I'm fighting ISIS, or I'm providing state security, or I'm providing security for critical infrastructure, or I'm doing the bidding of the international community's work here in Libya, or I'm bringing human security to the people again. They were trying to find the currency or the narrative that would fit And in so doing so, they've created in the process a very nasty civil war that has dragged the country into now almost an economic crisis. We're now pretty much facing economic Armageddon, which is a tragedy given that Gaddafi, as incompetent as he may have been, has left the country with around $320 billion in assets. We're now somewhere towards 40 billion. A country with such oil resource and oil resource wealth is now teetering on debt. So I think it's a real shame in that respect as to where the diagnosis of Libya is today. In terms of bringing it back from the brink, we have to quarantine that kind of competition. We've got to move away from the idea of enormous numbers and billions of dollars. And locally, we have to understand that we need to work together as groups, and we have to understand what pluralism is. Now, you have to remember this country has never had democratic elections in its history. For at least 60 years, it hasn't had any kind of elections. And for the first time in its history, we would be talking about not only those who would win, but those who would lose and have to lose peacefully, and those who would win and have to win peacefully. That's part of democratic culture that Libyans have to understand.
If I could interject too, it seems like Go ahead.
I would just like to make the final point, which is that not only do we have to accept those pluralistic elements, but we have to understand that Libya is part of a wider transition that's been taking place since the Arab Spring in 2011, which is also about pluralism, and it's also about regime maintenance and security. Now, Libya has been caught right in the crosswinds of this bigger ideological and bigger regional war, and it needs regional partners to understand that by providing more weapons in and flowing more money into the civil war and hoping that your faction or your side in the civil war might win is still going to create much more instability. It's still going to create much more cross-border instability and insecurity. And it's also going to create a safe haven or a basket case for groups like ISIS or the next group to come in, which will also create regional instability. So you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't just concentrate on creating a civil war in Libya and trying to get one faction to win over the other in the name of regime maintenance, but then realizing by doing so, you've created long-term security issues and challenges that are not going to go anywhere. This isn't the big bad West necessarily behind this anymore. So these are Arab regional partners that are funding civil wars in Libya.
So Ahmed, who are the regional partners that have the will to get a grasp of this situation?
Nobody. I totally agree with what my colleague said. The amount of incentives for deepening the crisis in Libya, of course, the amazing amount of wealth that Libya has, which is basically up for grabs now, the role that Egypt and the United Arab Emirates and Qatar are playing in this role has not been very helpful at all. But at the end of the day, the problem in Libya, although I'm not really an expert in Libya, I think without building a strong bureaucracy, a strong state, then there will be no chance for any positive movement in Libya. And I just don't see where would this state come from. Libya has very little experience in centralized state structures. So I think the problem really in Libya is so compound, so complex. And the last thing that the Egyptians want to do now is to get involved in this conflict in Libya, and doing that not for any positive contribution that they can make, but mainly to divert attention from problems that they themselves are having in Egypt itself. Now, these two countries next to each other, and the complexity of conditions in both of them, and the way that the Egyptian regime is trying to tie somehow what has happened in Egypt yesterday to the situation in Libya, can only make things worse.
What role do economics and the wealth that is up for grabs in Libya play in the way that Egypt chooses to interact with Libya? Ahmed, I want you to answer that.
I'm not sure I can answer that. I can answer that as far as the economic conditions in Egypt are concerned. I'm afraid I don't know much about Libya. As far as the economic conditions in Egypt are concerned, the government is now faced with a big dilemma, and it's not clear how it's going to deal with this dilemma. Do they abide by the rules and the commands that are coming to them from the International Monetary Fund to deal with inflation as the main problem that they're facing, or to deal with the problem of unemployment and social justice? And the problem is that the tools that you require to deal with one of these problems are exactly the opposite of the tools that you need to deal with the other problem. So far, it seems that the government has chosen to deal with the problem of inflation, which leaves the other major problem of youth unemployment in particular all those young people who don't see any opportunity, who don't have any clear positive vision for the future, you basically give them the opportunity, create the environment that would make them more susceptible to be radicalized and to be co-opted into radical groups.
And unfortunately, we are out of time, gentlemen. My apologies. So thank you both for the conversation. That's going to have to be the last word. Thank you to Anas Gomati and Ahmed Badawi, and thank you for watching. You can watch the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on Twitter as well. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Richelle, Carey, and the entire team, bye for now.